Yeah, so welcome and thanks for coming to our kickoff event of the Data Extractivism and Global Inequality series here at DIIS. First of all, we're really happy to see so many of you here in person, and we would also like to say hi to the people online. Thank you for joining us. This event will be live streamed, so you can find it online afterwards. And it's a part of a seminar series of our research initiative, DIIS Tech. It's organized by my colleagues Marie Colling over there and Sophie Henriksen and I. And at this first event, I would like to briefly tell you about this series which Sophie, Marie and I realized as a response to a common theme that derives out of our own individual research here at DIIS. Sophie's PhD, for example, focuses on Silicon Valley, where she examines humanitarian action in global refugee crises with a focus on the increasing amount of partnerships between humanitarian organizations and technology businesses. Marie, for example, is interested in women's struggles over credit access and debt payments in Brazil, in which credit assessment schemes are based on algorithmic technologies. My PhD investigates data-driven tools and infrastructures for sexual and reproductive health services in Kenya, and how data flows between the technology ecosystem in Nairobi as well as informal settlements in across Nairobi where the respective health tech is being implemented. What quickly became apparent, at least in my research, is that those NGOs as well as private companies increasingly extract data from the people they are trying to serve. And on the one hand, this is due to their support of health and well-being services and to generate knowledge. On the other hand, often the data is also being used for marketization processes and other forms of commodification. And that is where data extractivism comes into play. Data extractivism is a term that derives from post-colonial or decolonial studies, and it situates the large-scale collection of data that we experience today in a long history of capitalism and colonialism. As such, contemporary data practices are seen as the continued extraction of value from human and ecological resources, but now through harvesting data and automatization processes through algorithms, for example. Rather than mediating inequalities, many of such data extracting schemes might actually be fueling inequalities across the globe, and that was our part of departure. That was our part of departure for the seminar series. So today we have invited two speakers from major NGOs here in Denmark, the Danish Refugee Council as well as the Danish Red Cross, to discuss how they collect, analyze, and use data in their humanitarian response. We will be discussing the lessons learned and the opportunities that these processes may bring, but we will also look at the potential pitfalls of technology use and data collection in those contexts. After having heard from Alexander and Emil, we will continue with our discussion, and I have decided that while we might have a couple of questions to each other, which I already know, we met 30 minutes before and there was a vivid discussion, I would prefer including a Q&A even before 4, before 4, no worries, where you, the audience, will have the possibility to ask questions too. So I hope that this will be a relatively free-flowing and a joint, broader discussion about data extractivism and the work that your organizations are doing. So I would like to give the word to Alexander, who will tell us more about how the Danish Refugee Council has been exploring how to leverage AI to better predict future displacements and to enable anticipatory action activities that can prevent or mitigate the impact of shocks causing displacement. Alexander is a senior analyst and a global advisor at the Danish Refugee Council, where he is responsible for advancing the use of data and analytics across the organization, as well as developing their approach to anticipatory action. He's a core member of the Global Working Group on Anticipatory Action in Conflict, as well as a member of several policy and user boards on EU projects related to the use of AI in humanitarian contexts. So please give a hand to Alexander.
Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you can hear me okay. Yes, good. So basically, I'll just give a little bit of a background of how we got into this type of work and what we've been doing so far, and how, as mentioned, we're trying to turn it into sort of anticipatory action responses. So I think we started exploring the use of AI and predictive analytics more broadly around 5 years ago, and it came sort of from, several crises, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, where there was a feeling in our organization that could we have been better at predicting these events. We were sort of, caught off guard to some extent, and at the same time we were sort of seeing, the private sector where this talk around big data and AI was emerging, and were there opportunities for us as a humanitarian actor to sort of leverage these technologies as well. So we entered into a partnership with IBM and worked with them initially on developing our first models. And the work we've been doing since has sort of focused around trying to come up with these models to essentially provide sort of better sort of scenarios and forecasts of displacement to inform humanitarian action, not only by ourselves but also by the wider humanitarian sector. So all the models we develop, we put out openly for other actors to use as well. So what we've come up with so far are 3 models. So we initially developed this foresight model, which can be used to predict how many displaced people, so that's both IDPs or internally displaced people, refugees and asylum seekers, there will be from a country 1 to 3 years into the future. It covers 26 countries around the world, so all the sort of major displacement crises we have at the moment. And when we were done with that model, that was the one we developed together with IBM. Our staff was saying, super interesting. We can use this for, strategic planning, maybe some advocacy purposes, but it's not very operational. It doesn't tell us where people are going to be displaced or when and exactly how they're going to move. So can you give us something that's a bit more sort of can help us on a more day-to-day basis? So on the basis of that, we developed this sort of so-called WACAFI model to support the more sort of operational response. So there we're looking at sort of the sub-national level, so at what's also called Admin 1 and Admin 2 level, so regions or municipalities in countries, and predicting 3 to 4 months into the future how many people will be displaced at that level. And both of these models are sort of leveraging AI or machine learning technologies, and I can talk more about that as well, but I'll spare the details for now. The last model we then also focused on was looking at drought displacement instead, because we also realized that a lot of the places where we work, people are being displaced by conflict, but they're also being displaced by droughts, they're being displaced by floods and so on. So it doesn't really make sense for us to sort of try to narrow ourselves to just looking at what type of displacement, because we often respond to different types of displacement. So if we really want to become anticipatory, we need to also be able to anticipate other types of shocks. So that model essentially looks at sort of simulating, we can use to simulate based on weather forecast, how potential drought can lead to displacement among pastoralist communities, focusing on the Horn of Africa. The models are all developed based on open source data, so we're not using any personal data, and it's sort of very simple data. I would say we're not scraping Facebook or Twitter data and these type of things. We're not using satellite imagery data and so on. So a lot of it is, for example, for the foresight model, a lot of it is World Bank development indicator, those type of data from different UN agencies, and we look at aspects such as conflict, governance aspects, economy, and so on. And in foresight, we have more than 140 different indicators that we use. And on the subnational model, the WACAFI model, it's a lot less because there's a lot less data available at the subnational level. But here we have around 25 indicators primarily related to conflict. For this model, we are now exploring integrating some of the protection monitoring data that we are collecting. So we are constantly around the world, going around and talking with displacement affected communities and getting data on how they see their own environment, the safety, their ability to move around, and so on. And we're starting to analyze to what extent we can use that in these type of models. And that, of course, also creates a lot of issues and challenges, which we can discuss further. And I'll not focus on the drought model, but that uses slightly different types of data, and it's a slightly different type of approach. And what we can see with this so far is that it actually works quite well. So essentially the way we're evaluating these models is that we train it on all this historical data, and then, for example, ask the model to predict, Syria, we give you data up until 2011, and then ask you to predict 2012. How many people would be displaced from Syria? Of course, we know how many people were displaced that year, so we can see how close does that number come to the actual number of displaced people. And on average, the more than 200 historical forecasts we've made so far with the foresight model has a margin of error around 18%. But it differs quite a lot from countries to countries. So here you can see the best performing countries like Burundi, the Central African Republic, Guatemala, and Afghanistan. The average margin of error on those forecasts are less than 10% of the actual displacement levels. And then in some of the worst performing countries like Ethiopia and Libya, for example, it's higher than around 30% or higher. But one of the other things is, is 18% on average, is that good or bad? I mean, it also depends a little bit on what's your alternative. Are there better approaches to planning in the humanitarian sector, for example? And one of the instruments we use in the humanitarian sector is the so-called humanitarian response plans, where all the different humanitarian agencies in a country come together, typically around September, October, and discuss, what I'm going to do next year, and of course also what are the, number of displaced people we are going to support in the coming year. So we try to analyze how well does our model work compared to those numbers in those reports, and we can see that in I think it's around 17 of the countries out of 21 where we can compare. So all the green ones here, our model is more accurate than the numbers, planning figures that are being used in the humanitarian response plans for now. Another interesting thing we can see is that our model in the countries tend to become better over time. That sort of goes a little bit with the methodology, this machine learning, that the more years a conflict has existed, the more patterns and relationships the model can detect in the data, and thereby become more accurate in predicting what's going to happen next. But there's nothing in the humanitarian response plans that indicate that the longer a conflict has been, the better the humans become at planning and predicting the numbers in the future. And I think the last interesting takeaway from our results, the positive takeaways, is that it works really well in different types of displacement settings as well. So you can see again, if we look at the best performing countries, Burundi, the Central African Republic, Guatemala, Afghanistan, very different, of course, geographically spread out, but also very different type of displacement dynamics, and still the model performs very well in these different settings. So that's a positive sales pitch that I'll give you in the elevator. And if you then walk with me to the bar and give me a beer, then I'll tell you this story as well. Or maybe before that, actually, the subnational forecasting model, despite having fewer indicators, actually tend to be more accurate than this national level one. So it also performs well at the more shorter time horizons and subnational level. Now, this is then the story I'll tell you when you give me a beer, which are the two significant limitations. And if you remember what I told you, the reason we set out to do this was to try to predict the Rohingya crisis and the so-called refugee crisis to Europe and so on. And actually, the models are not very good at that at all. So what you see here is that the higher the relative change in the number of displaced people, the higher the error margins on these models in the predictions. So it doesn't predict Ukraine last year, didn't predict Sudan this year, and so on. So these sort of unprecedented or surges in displacement, the models cannot or find it very difficult to predict. And so it's good at predicting the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows in displacement, but these sort of ruptures that comes along the way, it doesn't capture. And a bit related to that, the model also tends to be conservative, so around 2/3 of the forecast underestimate the level of displacement for the coming year. Some would argue that's good, so we don't cry wolf, but others will say we end up being sort of underprepared. So one of the ways we sort of advocate using this is, first of all, you should never base your decisions solely on these models, because they're not good enough at, for example, capturing these type of elements. But it's a good conversation starter because it tends to have some degree of accuracy. And one of the things we can do with the models is also to make scenario-based forecasts. So we can take qualitative analysis and information from, for example, our country directors, and then say essentially tweak the parameters in these models to do sort of what-if scenarios. So if there is an election next year and we know that typically leads to violence, how many could potentially lead to displacement? So that's another way of sort of using these models. But after then developing these models, we still realized that there was still a challenge in actually getting our organizations and also partners to use them to inform action, even with these limitations. So then we started exploring this anticipatory action, which is essentially sort of an approach that's been emerging in the last, I would say, probably 10 years in the humanitarian sector, which has been looking at, can we make humanitarian responses a little bit less reactive? So the way we typically act in the humanitarian sector is that there's a shock, there's an earthquake, or there's a conflict that's erupting, and then we start fundraising maybe, or we have a little bit of money, we do needs assessment, we get our staff out into the field, and then we can start delivering support to affected populations. And of course, the longer that process takes, the higher the humanitarian needs will be. I mean, if you look at the Sudan crisis, where people have been, arriving at the borders, they've been living out in the open for weeks. I mean, they don't get health assistance, there's kids out of school, and all these type of things. Of course, the longer you don't have medicine, the more sick you become, and your humanitarian needs will grow. So with these, despite the limitations in these models, if we can be better at forecasting that these shocks happen, then we can move essentially our response up earlier, so that we can already, before the shock happens, start doing, for example, needs assessment. We can start the fundraising, release the funding. We can get staff on the ground, and so on. So that's sort of what we have been trying to use these models for. And because of the limitations, as I said, we wouldn't build a mechanism around these models where it's only the model that's feeding into the decision making, but we engage with the affected communities and essentially also help them define what are the type of activities and support that they think could be relevant, let's say 1 or 2 months before any of these shocks happen. We set up monitoring mechanisms, again, getting the community to give us feedback so that we can say, well, now our model is predicting a potential increase in displacement. How are things actually looking on the ground in your communities? Does this seem to validate those predictions, or does it contradict the predictions? And essentially both of these data points then go into the decision making process. So this is where we've been in Somalia, where we've been setting up these local committees and developed these action plans, and actually triggered action earlier this year in response to drought. And we are now developing something similar in South Sudan and Burkina Faso, where it's focused on conflict-induced displacement. And essentially what we're envisioning that we can do with this, so again, this is a new approach, and we'll sort of be testing it out in the coming months, is to essentially look at supporting people in the place of origin, so where people are being displaced from, and that can be, providing just information to the communities. It can also try to defuse tensions when it's conflict-induced displacements. It's identifying what the needs are, and so on. But then also making sure that we are ready to support people as they move, as they become displaced, making sure that they have access to services, and of course making sure that we are prepared in the host communities where people will arrive. So again, that they don't have to wait for weeks until they actually get the support they need, and we see the humanitarian needs rising. So we sort of see this as potentially a more sort of timely and dignified and also cost efficient of doing humanitarian responses, and are sort of now looking to scale this up also to more context and have sort of a multi-hazard approach where we look at all these different types of shock together and see how we can become better prepared to essentially respond to those shocks. I think that was what I had to present today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think that's mine. But yes. Now we're moving on to Emil Brøgger, who is presenting or showing us concrete examples of how the Danish Red Cross is working with its partners to use forecasts and predictive analysis along with community-level vulnerability data to anticipate the impact of weather-related hazards and disasters. Emil is a trained anthropologist and interested in how to combine a qualitative approach with quantitative approaches to data analysis. He has spent the last 5 years working with data and digital literacy within the Danish Red Cross International Department. So please give a hand to Emil.
Yeah, thank you. Is it okay? You can hear me? Good. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak a little bit about how we in the Danish Red Cross have been working with what we choose to call data-informed decision-making, which includes, of course, also the use of predictive analysis to a certain extent. But first, actually, a little correction, because the Danish Red Cross is actually not an NGO. I know that's the very typical thing for a Red Cross person to say as the first thing, but basically we do have an auxiliary role in relation to the government, which we will come back to what that means in the countries where we are supporting implementation. But just shortly to say that the Danish Red Cross, we have our own country representation and country offices in approximately 23 countries around the world, spread out primarily through these 3 regions, as you can see here. And we are never implementing ourselves any projects internationally. So in any country that we support, it will always be through that local national society that we are supporting implementation. And that's also why we have a strong emphasis on long-term bilateral support to these national societies, that we want to invest in them and their capacities. It also means that we are part of a Red Cross and Red Crescent network of 192 national societies around the world. We're definitely, as you can see, not collaborating with everyone in it, but it is a strong network to be part of, where I think the last estimation was that there are more than 16 million volunteers working within this network across the world. So a little bit more on the Danish Red Cross. So internationally, we are working with what we call these 3 breakthroughs. Of course, today I won't be talking about all 3. I'll primarily focus on the second one, on disasters damage fewer lives. But we are working also with data analysis and digital tools in all these 3 areas. But yeah, so today, focus a little bit more on how we work with anticipatory action as well, as mentioned by Alexander. But what we basically do here is that, of course, we respond to a lot of weather-related disasters and extreme events. We are working a lot still with our partners in doing so. We are investing a lot in preparing for responding to these emergencies. So we have a lot of funding also channeled to emergency preparedness. And of course, we assist vulnerable communities in trying to adapt to these more recurring and extreme climate events that are happening, by trying to build their resilience in that we know that they're coming. So how can we help them cope with these events? And all of these three we are combining in what we also work with and call anticipatory action. So basically, as touched upon by Alexander as well, this is something that we in the Danish Red Cross have been working with also for a number of years. And the typical sort of response cycle was that there was a risk, and you even had a forecast maybe of a hazard and a disaster event incoming. And then after the fact, you would send out an appeal and ask for funding and try to fundraise, and then coming with relief assistance after the fact. But what we are trying to do in more and more places around the world is to actually work with early action. So if we can forecast that something is happening, can we actually have pre-financing ready so that when a certain threshold is reached, these finances and this funding is released before this event happens? So we can actually also utilize the capacity and the preparedness that we've been working with the local communities with, in that they know if we send out an early warning and an alert, then they have a predefined list of activities that they know they should do now before something happens, which in the end, of course, both saves lives and livelihoods and also requires less funding for the relief assistance afterwards. The focus here is to define these triggers, which is also the tricky part, and then connect them to the pre-financing that makes this early action and early warnings possible to actually implement on the ground. And some of the analysis behind these triggers is something that we also work with called impact-based forecasting. So as also I have other anticipatory action colleagues working on this, and what they very famously keep continuously saying is that we are looking not what the weather will be, but what the weather will do instead. And some of the types of predictive analysis that we're trying to work with is to map these different types of layers, where you can see one is sort of the natural hazard area, so that we're trying to work with a lot of meteorological institutes and these type of things to have their forecasts coming in terms of what areas will be affected how. And then through our projects, we also do what we call vulnerability mapping. So of course, it depends on what type of hazard we're talking about. But typically, if we talk about flooding, it will of course be people living close to a river basin, and people who might not be able to flee or evacuate fast from the area. They will have a higher vulnerability index scoring. So we're working in the project areas and with our partners to try and overlay these different layers to actually be able to predefine where should we implement what kind of early warning and early actions in case a hazard is triggered. So this is also a bit of an example from Malawi, which is an example of an impact-based forecasting portal that has been developed together with the Malawi Red Cross and also external partners. And what you can see here is also how we're trying to work with different layers. And this is actually sort of an online and digital portal which is connected to, we call this, it's a GLOFASS database, which I'm pretty sure measures sort of and forecasts river discharge. So you can see the different areas where we have stations measuring, and you can see this trigger activation threshold. This is then the results of a whole process where we work with different partners and we work with experts to make these models and see when can we release pre-financed activities or pre-financing to fund early action and early warning. And then they set the specific trigger threshold here. So this means as soon as a 6-day forecast with a threshold is superseded, that will release the funding. That means that we can actually start implementing. And we have this tool to sort of keep track that we also have the people who are not experts in weather forecasting can actually follow this and get the alerts and will know what to do without understanding necessarily the analysis behind it. Yes. And it kind of ruined my layout of this slide. But anyway, what this is supposed to say is that we are the role of Danish Red Cross in this, like I mentioned. We are not necessarily the ones with a team of analysts who put together the specific predictive modeling or predictive analysis, but we are sort of the ones who engage with the people who have the expertise to do this, so that we can actually link the forecasts and the models that they are making with the people on the ground, with the communities that are to take local action. And as I mentioned, one of the consequences of the Red Cross being an auxiliary to the government is that we are working a lot in sort of the preparedness and response side, also with local disaster management agencies and government agencies in having the capacity to also use these tools themselves, and also activate whatever preparedness and capacity and response capacities that they have through their government system as well. Yes. So this is a map of the countries so far where we have been engaged for the past, I think it's also around 8 years that we have been engaged in different countries, working with the national societies and with the local governments in trying to set up these early action protocols, they're called, which is basically a description of what kind of forecasts are being used, what kind of incoming data is being used, what kind of modeling is being done, but also more importantly, what trigger levels are being set for what areas and what types of hazards, and what kind of response sort of operating procedures are to be activated if this threshold is met. As you can see, we've actually also had triggering quite a few places for the past couple of years, especially also in Mali. And in Nepal is also an example where we have been trying to work with the Nepalese government and their social protection scheme. So the way it works is that instead of the finances, we having to set up distribution of cash to communities, we're actually using the government's social protection scheme, which means that they have already included a lot of vulnerable people into this scheme, and that when we do cash distributions, we can have the setup done so that when the trigger is met, these distributions will be done automatically into people's bank accounts within a day, or at least a very short time. Another example I want to highlight is from Malawi, which is based also on early warning and early action for floods, primarily. And we actually had a trigger here earlier this year. And then at another time, we had a trigger where the threshold wasn't met for what we call a 5-year return period, which means that the sort of the size of the hazard was smaller than what you would expect to recur within a 5-year period. It was only a 2-year return period, which means that it's only the size you only expect it to happen every 2 years. So it means that the threshold wasn't set for the early action protocol, and that means we couldn't release the finances for the early action, even though we could see there would be communities that were going to be affected by this predictive analysis that we had showing us this. Luckily, we had access to other flexible funding that meant we could actually respond anyway. But this leads also as a bit of a segue into some of the ethical challenges that we also see in working with this predictive analysis, that when we actually have the resources to predict and to see needs, but we do not necessarily have the resources to actually respond to them. I think that's one of the key issues, especially in planning these processes. And again, you make this analysis available, but what is your plan for actually using that analysis for action on the ground? Another thing that my colleagues are also seeing more and more of as a risk is the weaponization of vulnerability data, especially like Alexander mentioned, when working in conflict settings. This model works because we've mapped out what areas, what population are vulnerable to what types of hazards, but that can also be sort of weaponized in terms of if that gets into combating partners' side, they want to utilize that information, especially when we're trying to collaborate with governments a lot. That is a huge risk and a challenge that needs to be planned carefully into the design of this use of predictive analysis. We are actually also now with the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center funding a PhD that's trying to look into when and how can these types of data actually be used as a weapon, especially, for instance, when there is a trigger happening, but only some people get the warning while others don't, if they're matching a category that's not to the liking of certain government agencies or this type of thing. So that's something we're trying also to understand more of. Then the final sort of ethical challenge I want to highlight here, although of course there are many more, is also this sort of institutional trust in the Red Cross and Red Cross Invest. Then when we come with the emblem, then communities might trust us more than they might other partners or other parties and other governments, which lies a huge obligation on us to actually use their data in ethical ways, and also make very clear agreements with who are we sharing the data with and how are we sharing the analysis versus the raw data and these types of questions. There was an example also where the Danish Red Cross, we were coming in with our national society partner, trying to do a vulnerability mapping and try to measure up some lands where the locals didn't want to give access, because at first they thought we were coming in to measure their lands and give it to the hotels who wanted to throw them out and build very nice hotels for tourists. So it just shows that it's a very real implication of working with these types of data, that you need to be able to communicate clearly and actually come through on these obligations you make to the people's data that you are using for this. Then to end on a little bit more of a happy note, if you could say that the future potential we definitely see in using predictive analysis, again, I've just mentioned a few highlights, but especially within epidemic preparedness. So especially, I think it's also in Kenya, we're looking at a project of how can we combine these weather forecasts with the forecasts of epidemic outbreaks, because we see clear correlations. So there's definitely opportunity to be able to forecast outbreaks of cholera or these different types of waterborne diseases, especially a lot better, and have a higher leeway time to act before we see a lot of cases being documented. This also links to how we are scaling up and trying to use community-based surveillance. So again, this also relates a bit more to the digital side, but how can we use digital tools to also connect this huge network of volunteers that are placed within the smallest community and the smallest village to actually very quickly, as soon as they sense, okay, now we have a few cases of dengue fever or of, again, cholera, these types of things, to use that community presence to actually be able to find out and react to these trends that we see rising much faster. The final one, strategic foresight. It's not the foresight model that Alexander has been presenting on, but more trying to work with also a more qualitative approach at a very strategic level that say, can we gather different multidisciplinary groups to actually do scenario analysis on how do we see different trends evolving over the next couple of 5 to 10 years. I think there's an interesting case recently I saw that the French military have employed sci-fi authors to come up and look within the next 50 to 100 years, how will warfare look like? We're probably not going to do the same, but at least the idea and the thinking behind it is something that we're very interested in also trying to look into. And again, to mix sort of these more quantitative approaches with also more qualitative approaches in terms of how can we do trend analysis and see how things are developing. That was it for me. You can find out more at our website, of course. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Emil. So now we're going to move on to the panel discussion / Q&A, and I will join you here. I'm aware that in our previous conversation, we already could see that you have a few questions to each other. But I would love to, first of all, say thank you. I've learned a lot. Great insights to how you work with data and how you apply those strategies. Perhaps because you ended on that note a little bit, I would like to know a little bit more about what are the limitations of how you can use data or how you can use predictive modeling.
No, I think, and maybe I would say sort of locally, of course, human behavior is very complex and not possible to fully determine how people are going to act in response to different kinds of shocks. So I think what we have in terms of the opportunities with these models is to become slightly better at foreseeing how certain events will unfold and how they on average will the trajectories of these type of events, but we'll never get the full answer, and I think you could say it's also positive, because that means we also still have to engage with people on the ground. We have to engage with these communities to understand the dynamics that are there. So when we have these debates about AI and automated decision making and so on, at least from where I'm sitting, I think it's a very far way off that we're anywhere sort of close to that in this space, because it is fortunately still very difficult to really predict human behavior.
Yeah, no, for sure. Agree a lot with that. I think the reason why I also insist on calling it data-informed decision-making is that it needs to inform a decision-making process where, for instance, predictive analysis is one method to inform this decision-making. It's definitely not necessarily always the best, which is why I also find it very interesting the way you're putting emphasis on also testing and evaluating these models and how accurate are they actually. But that's just one thing. Another thing is also to work a lot with decision makers in terms of these models. What are they saying and what are they not saying? Because again, there are, as you could also see in Alexander's presentation, a lot of underlying indicators that you can't explain that to someone needing to make a decision in 5 minutes. So you need to work with that as also an organizational approach to doing decision making. Yeah, for sure. And I think another aspect is again linking it to action. How are you interpreting it into not just action, but also the capacities to actually act on sort of the things that you are finding in your analysis and your insights. Because as we can see also in our experience from working with anticipatory action, again, it's great that we have a lot of external partners who are very knowledgeable in making these models and doing these predictions. But if that is not linked to working with the volunteers on the ground, that they know to get the boat when they get the message, then it's a lot of work for not really a lot of impact on the ground.
I can just briefly add, also pick up on what you said, Emil. I think, as I also said, we had some issues or challenges essentially getting an uptake in our organization with these models. And I think one of the big challenges or limitations of these more advanced AI models that we use is that they are so complex and difficult to understand, and it has this sort of black box nature, so we're not really sure what's going on. So when I give, a country director or regional director numbers saying, X number of people are going to be displaced next year in Somalia, if that doesn't necessarily square with their own assessment of the situation, they're naturally, of course, going to ask me, well, why is it predicting what it's predicting? And I can't give that answer because our model is not telling me why it's predicting what it's predicting. And obviously for a decision maker to then use that number, they would also be challenged and would need to explain, well, why do you think 1 million people is going to be displaced in Somalia? And for now, I respond to that by just saying, well, the model told me so. Is not a valid answer. Maybe in 10 years where people are more used to these models and just generally trust them, maybe that's a response, but it isn't for now. And therefore people sort of are hesitant at using that information. And therefore in many instances, a very simple model where you can easily explain what's going on is often can be a better approach, and maybe also if it at least can give the same type of accuracy essentially in the results.
Now, since you mentioned data-informed choices and modeling, I was wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit more on where you exactly get your data from. I mean, you mentioned open source, you mentioned a little bit also the field and also the collaborations with the team on the ground, but perhaps also collaborators like companies, or like who are you working with? Where do you get the data from? What kind of data do you get? And perhaps also who owns that data?
I'll go ahead. No, so we work only with open source data and so build our models around credible sort of data providers, I would say, and typically also data providers that have a global reach. Essentially, that's also sort of a resource question, that because we work in 40 countries around the world, we need to be able to develop these models for many different countries. And I mean, we have 2 or 3 data scientists in our organization. So if we had to sit and find data for each single country, we wouldn't have the resource. So we build it around these sort of, World Bank or UN agencies. But there are a lot of course, actors that are, and we've also, thinking about that use private sector data. Facebook is very, popular, and Twitter data and these type of things. And we've sort of been shying away from those type of data sources, both because it's a resource question. It's difficult to get those relationships with these private companies, and it comes again with a lot of ethical challenges and risks as well. I think a major aspect for us is really around, in the countries where we work, the number of people that are actually on Facebook or using Twitter and so on is not very high, and the people that do use these type of social media are typically also the more affluent, and the people we want to target are typically the poor and most vulnerable who are not on Twitter and Facebook. So if we start incorporating their data, the affluent populations or segments into our models, our model can tend to have a bias towards those type of populations. So that's one of the sort of reasons why we don't use that type of data.
Yeah, and I can say one of the challenges also we have in working with this anticipatory action and working with it in such a local context is to, again, the granularity of data that we need as well to make this work. Because yes, we are also trying as much as we can to use open source data, but that's where we really depend on also, especially regional meteorological institutes and these type of sort of actors and organizations to help us actually get the data for that specific flood running through this specific community. Because again, when we are trying to also work with collecting this vulnerability data, oftentimes that's part of the project financing we get, is also to make this mapping and conduct these data collections and do these vulnerability indexes, which again means it's a very local sort of exercise typically, and it becomes very hard to scale in that sense. So that's definitely some of the challenges that we see, even though we're also trying to push and work a lot with especially the open source. I think one of the lessons we have taken from this is also working with replicability. So it might not necessarily be the same sources or the same organizations that we're getting data from, but if we're trying to do it in the same way, it becomes easier also for other actors to engage in the same type of anticipatory action and working with this type of modeling.
Is that a time where maybe one of your questions come up, or? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I would actually like to ask you, this sort of collaboration you've had with IBM in developing this foresight model, if you could elaborate a little bit on sort of the lessons learned coming from that, but also how you see humanitarian organizations wanting to engage more in these types of partnerships, sort of not necessarily do's and don'ts, but what type of questions do you need to ask the partner, and what types of sort of delineations do you need to make and agreements do you need to make that work in a humanitarian setting?
Yeah, no, I think a good question. So so just a way of background. I mean, we worked with IBM for 3 years in this sort of pro bono collaboration. It was established prior to me joining the Danish Refugee Council, but I know, of course, some of the background. But essentially, the way it came about was that they had actually sort of on their own, they had a Syrian refugee working for them that, in the wake of the 2015 refugee flows to Europe, she was sort of thinking, what can we do as IBM in this space? How can we act? Because she was just seeing, all these Syrians coming to Europe, and then the way the response was just undignified. So they actually initially developed their own model to try to see if they could predict these flows, and after consulting with different NGOs, of course they didn't have any use for them themselves. They couldn't use this information for their operation, but they were hoping an NGO or UN agency would be interested in using this type of model. So we then started an engagement with them on the basis of that, and starting looking at this. For us, that partnership was really sort of critical in in sort of providing us with the resources and capacity to build this type of work in our organization. It was not something we had done before. We didn't have any knowledge or expertise in that field or any resources that could take this up. And the amount of resources that IBM committed to that project was really phenomenal. I think what was key, of course, was also that it was very clear that we collect a lot of data ourselves, and it was clear that we could not, for example, start looking at using that in our models, because that could potentially be some data sharing with IBM that we simply couldn't sort of enter into, because of course we wouldn't be able to control what IBM potentially would use that data for in the end. So the whole, of course, of having clear agreements in the beginning when you enter those type of partnership around the ownership of the final outputs and the models, and also ensuring that what is the sustainability of doing this? Is it something you can take on yourself, or are they building something that you essentially can't work with afterwards, and then you essentially sort of tied into their services and have to rely on them for future support? Was another thing that was very important for us, that it was something that we could essentially work with on our own afterwards. And we now have the model ourselves and are fully sort of operating it without their support. On a more general note, I think when you enter into these partnerships with the private sector, I think it is quite important to do, of course, your due diligence. What is this type of company? And I think we've seen collaborations in this sector where you are, could be quite concerned around what were the reasons, what were the intent of these private companies entering into these agreements, and were there really proper due diligence when those agreements were established. But I think if they are structured in the right fashion, they can really provide you with an access to knowledge and expertise that would otherwise be difficult for us essentially to invest in and build up on our own. So I think that was our gain from it.
Maybe that's also a good time to open it to the... Okay, I already see some hands. That's beautiful. I think you were first, so maybe wait for the microphone so that our online participants can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentations. It was super interesting. You touched a little bit upon this, but I'm actually really interested in how do you see the outputs of your models embedded in your respective organizational processes? So your model predicts something like an area. Is it still like more of an experimental thing where you or somebody has to write an email like, hey, we need to meet and let's talk about this? Or are you actually like embedded in a process, like somebody reviewing your model, or like how do you communicate about it? Like I'm just really interested in like what comes after the prediction and how is it embedded in your respective organizations?
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. I think for us, one of the key things in working with anticipatory action and predictive analysis is that it has to be the full package. We can't stop at just having nice models, doing nice predictions. It has to be connected to creating impact and saving lives and livelihoods on the ground. And that's also the approach we take when, again, I think we found some ways of working with anticipatory action that we are now trying to scale also, because we've seen that there is also a value in keeping it simple, if that makes sense, on the modeling side. That, again, when we talk about these thresholds and these triggers, you can't have 16 different types of indicators going into one trigger, because then you might have 14 of them are spiking, but the last 2 are not, so you don't have the financing to do something. And then it becomes a bit too disconnectedness from the actual need on the ground. So I think that's the approach that has also been, I think, widely accepted, also not just in the Danish Red Cross, but throughout the Red Cross movement and for others, that's where the value is. That is, if you can make something that is simple enough that you can work with it, but still gives you the edge that you can actually implement things 3 or 6 days in advance of something happening.
Yeah, I mean, kind of similar. So essentially, the way we've, for example, with the initial first pilot we had was around supporting communities in Somalia ahead of drought. So we set up this mechanism. We sort of mimicked what the Red Cross had been doing there, because they are sort of 5-10 years ahead of us on the sort of anticipatory action side of things. And then we're setting up these local committees, as you saw, and then we essentially on a bi-weekly basis, based on the most recent weather forecast, simulating how many could potentially be displaced if the seasonal sort of weather forecast unfolds like it's doing. And then every time we were doing these simulations, we would go to these communities, these sort of villages of 200-300 people, and essentially explaining sort of these were the results of these simulations, and how's the situation looking in your community, how does that square with your outlook and how you see the situation right now and the crops and so on. And then then in the end of February, they sort of essentially came together. We were simulating now an increase in displacement, and the communities were also then telling us that they were sort of running out of water at that point. So then we initiated this action sort of probably around 1 month, 1.5 months before sort of what would be the peak of the drought.
I think just to add one thought is that it also really depends on what sort of hazard or what kind of scenario you're looking at, because it's easier for me to say keep it simple when we're talking about flooding, because I mean that you have a small amount of indicators that you can actually use, but when you talk about displacement, when you talk about conflict, it's such a complex area where there are so many drivers impacting the outcome of things that it needs to get complicated to be able to actually get insights on it. And I think that's the challenge that you would probably also agree in terms of how do you take that complexity and turn it into something actionable, which I think is a key area that we should invest definitely a lot more in.
I think we also had a question over there. Yeah, Nina.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nina. This is a question for you, Alexander, because I read this very influential piece you wrote early in the year about big numbers and how wrong they are in predicting the number of refugees and migrants in the world. So obviously your data are different from these big numbers, and you show that very well in your piece, how there's a lot of reproduction of big numbers. But when you say open source and credible data providers, I'm still wondering, because you're criticizing the UN, the World Bank and others, right? So how do you distinguish these data sources to avoid falling into that trap?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you got me there. And thank you for mentioning that article. No, it's a very good point. You could say the way I would differentiate it is, and that particular issue there is that, so we base it, you could say, not on other forecasts. That's sort of a discussion we're having, especially when you look at including, for example, how is climate change going to affect these trajectories and weather phenomena and so on. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to say the way our model works is essentially how were things based on how things were in 2022, how many are going to be displaced in 2023. And for weather events, that in many cases doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like we know El Nino and El Niña and these type of things now are impacting, but that didn't show in the 2022. So we don't include these forecasts because they include a much higher degree of certainty. So we base it on what is more objectively has actually happened. So what was the GDP last year in Afghanistan? Then you can start questioning, are they then accurate even with these data sources? And you're right that of course there are a lot of limitations and gaps. I know there's a lot, gender biases, for example, and how they are included and counted. So it's a challenge, but you could say in the end, what it comes down to is to what extent are we still accurate, regardless of whether not regardless, but even with these flaws, can we still provide accurate forecasts. And with the limitations that are there, we're still able to do that. And I think you could say they are also sources that people tend to rely on, but of course you still have to recognize that, those gaps. But
Sophie has a question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both of you for really, really interesting and insightful presentations. I learned a lot. When both of you were talking, my thought was, wow, that's a lot of work into possibly predicting these emergencies. And so I was wondering how much of all this work you're doing is driven by requirements from donors for both new ways of doing humanitarian response that's data-driven, but also maybe new ways of documenting and proving the impact that you have, and how much of that is required by donors?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think my initial response will be more sort of indirectly driven by donors, in the sense that humanitarian funding is not increasing with the same rate that disasters and extreme weather events are. And we have also seen that to be able to still sort of work with lessening the impact on lives and livelihoods that these weather-related events do, we have to do something differently. And this anticipatory action scheme, in trying to work with predictive analysis to do something before, as I also tried to show, is that the investment is really good if you talk about it in financial terms, because you save a lot of money in response, in the need for response activities after the fact, if you've actually done early warnings and early actions before the fact. One thing is sort of the humanitarian value, that of course the impact is less, but also that in terms of utilizing the funding that donors make available in better ways, basically in creating more value for the financing we do have. And I think that's also one of the reasons why Danish Red Cross, we've been quite investing and also in trying to work with sort of insurance-based solutions. So for sure, I think it's more in that sense. I would say that is the biggest driver. But then, of course, I think especially working with institutions like the EU, where there are a lot of requirements, and also actually documenting the impact you do and the results you get, I think is good, as long as that approach is aligned across donors. So that's, I mean, we've been very grateful to the foreign ministry that we actually do have flexible funding, that we can use it in ways that we see fit. But it's also something we continuously advocate with them, that the requirements we get from donors need to be aligned, because the more they're aligned, the less resources we have to spend on actually reporting, and the more we can actually channel to the people and to the projects that make a difference. So I would say it's primarily for us also driven by seeing sort of the advantage of actually, and the bigger impact of working before the fact.
Yeah, I would sort of echo that to a large extent. I think I think there are certain donors that are quite interested in this approach, and see it also as sort of an innovative way of doing humanitarian responses, and a need to become smarter and so on. So that are pushing some of these agendas. But again, I wouldn't say it's something that sort of directly as a requirement, but more something as something they've sort of indirectly through the lack of funding, but something you could say are encouraged and interested in exploring, and potentially down the line you would maybe see more requirements along that line, that they expect us to become better at using data and these type of things. But I still, in many spheres, I would say it's still a bit of a sort of pilot stage, a lot of how these models are being applied. Then you of course still also see in the broader space donors, institutions that are investing quite a lot in the same type of models, but of course with other purposes, such as understanding migration flows to Europe and these type of things, which has other connotations than what we're talking about.
We have another question from Robin.
Thank you. This is also a question to you, Alexander. I was very interested in your discussion of the historical predictions. And and I had two questions. One, you said you had an average of 18% accuracy in looking at the historical predictions, but with quite a range of variation from, I think you said 8 to 30%. So that's a big difference. So I was curious if there were some meta-reflections on what makes it work more accurately, these kinds of models, and what doesn't. And then you talked about, of course, it doesn't account for unprecedented events like Ukraine and Sudan. And so I'm curious, what happens with that data? Does that unprecedented, historical events become incorporated into, the number crunching and therefore change the kinds of predictions, maybe complexify the kinds of questions you will ask about political ideology or history of conflict or something? Or does it remain an anomaly in terms of these broad patterns?
Yeah, very good questions. So the first one, sort of on the accuracy and the range, and why do we see this different range? I think there are sort of two responses to that. One is, how many times have there been unprecedented events in a country where we've had these big missed forecasts that would drive up essentially your average or have a higher average margin of error, and so a case like Burkina Faso, which has a fairly high margin of error, where you could say the initial forecast when that conflict erupted was maybe off 90% or something like that. And when you then have 5-6 years of evaluating, obviously you get quite a high average, even if it actually becomes quite accurate the following years. Because what we can see with the model is actually after that initial unprecedented event, it's becoming quite good at then understanding how will it unfold from there, how will it evolve. The other thing we can see, or two other things. One is also then going to your about data credibility. I think where we see the big challenge around data credibility is maybe not so much the input data, but essentially the numbers we are predicting. So the numbers from UNHCR and especially around IDP numbers of internally displaced. In a country like Ethiopia, where I'm living, we can see that there are some very unusual developments in the IDP numbers. And how they also fluctuate quite a lot from year to year and has a very weak relationship with, for example, conflict. And there's a number of reasons for that. For example, right now in Ethiopia, you have in Tigray, you have 500,000 people internally displaced up in that region in certain cities. And the school year is starting now. And most of those people are living in schools. So that means in 1 week from now, most of these people will be forced out of the schools and probably will have to return. So will they then be counted as returns? And that's a dynamic, of course, that our model has a hard time on, capturing those type of aspects. And the last small thing is also around that we base our model on national level data. So when you have regionally confined conflicts, it can sometimes be difficult to see that in the national data we are looking at. So if we take the Myanmar conflict, a lot of things were going great in Myanmar at that point in time, actually. I mean, if you looked at governance indicators and democratic reforms and so on, all these things were positive, which we would usually see a deterioration in those when you see displacement because of conflict. But because it was sort of so confined to Rakhine state at that point in time, you still had this massive displacement, but despite a lot of the indicators actually being on positive trajectories. On the unprecedented events, how we then manage that afterwards. One of the aspects, of course, with these models is that they learn. So hopefully next time if Ukraine had an incident like this in 2 years' time, our model would be better at picking it up. It would never predict the full scale of what we've just seen. But of course, the more that there are of these events, it becomes better at understanding what actually triggers those events. But it also leads us to, of course, look at are there data issues or are there other indicators we should be looking at to capture this type of conflict? In the case of Ukraine, our model is confined to looking at data from that specific country, because most of the conflicts we're actually working in, it's within the states that are you have these conflicts. But of course, if you wanted to predict Ukraine, it would have been good to include data from Russia as well to understand that. And from understanding the politics of it can be difficult, but are there any data points that can indicate that? And I think the last thing we are also looking at is, to some extent, I think, you reach a point where you can't find more of the underlying, the sort of the root cause data of displacement. But then sort of flipping the focus a little bit and saying, instead of looking at data that can explain why people are being displaced, then you can also look at the signals of potential future displacement. So there's been some good studies done. For example, Georgetown, they made a model in Iraq where they could see that there was an increase in houses listed for sale. That was a good predictor of displacement because people were selling their houses before ISIS would come and take over the cities. In Somalia, UNHCR made a model where one of the good predictors was goat prices, because goats couldn't make the journey when people were displaced. They would die. Camels could do it and so on, but goats couldn't. So people were selling all their goats before being displaced at the markets. And then you could also see where they were going, because in the other markets where they arrived, then all the prices of goats went up because they were then buying goats in the places where they arrived. So of course, it's not the goat prices that's driving the displacement here, but it's a signal that people are leaving. And that can be another way of looking at it when we can't use the root cause data essentially to capture the dynamics. That's a long response, sorry.
We have another question, yeah.
Hi, my name is Cecilia, and thank you for the presentations. Very thought-provoking, and I've learned a lot as well. One question I have is, you're developing very sophisticated ways of collecting data to predict and to work in partnership with the local organizations. Do you reflect on how the data that you collect and the measurements and all that can be misused at some point? And I'm saying this because we as social scientists get very excited when we collect data and we develop measurements and we want more and more. But then there's a point where you have to reflect on where the data, the possible misuses of the data we collect. And that's something related to the ethics of doing research. So I was wondering about that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I can say, especially when we're collecting at household level, that is definitely part of also what we are continuously working with, and why I have a job, basically, is to constantly work with how can we ingrain that into the institutional and organizational processes we have, that just becomes a normal question to ask yourself, that do I really need to add this question to my already 16-page survey? Do we really want to use this background variable for an analysis, for a decision, or are we just collecting it because it's nice and that's what you usually do? So I think one of the approaches that we're trying to take is looking at standardization a lot. So both across, of course, the operations that we have, but also looking within a country and the partners that we're working with here, because again, let's say, again, Malawi is an example. We have Danish Red Cross. We are supporting the Malawi Red Cross in different projects. We also have the Netherlands Red Cross and perhaps the British Red Cross. So we have a lot of different partners working basically with the same implementing partner, but they might have different donors coming with different requirements, and each organization might have their own standard tool they want to use. So the approach that we're trying to take is really try to gather all the partners working with that national society, and of course have that be done by the national society themselves as much as possible, to say, can we standardize so that when we do data collection on vulnerability, or when we do it on these different exercises, we have one standard way of doing it that is really thought through of why we're collecting the data we are. So definitely something we're working with and realize is a big challenge to implement everywhere.
Speaking about the household collection, or did you wanted to add something? No? Otherwise, maybe my question will will inspire you. I mean, the session is called Data Extractivism, right? And we've been looking at some theories and some literature that takes a more colonial approach to data harvesting, as in like data being a new resource to extract from human bodies or human life in general. And now you mentioned the nice to collect sentence. So what is at stake for the people of concern, for the people that you're working with, that you're trying to serve? In what way are they aware of data collection? In what way do they consent to it? Are they aware of how the data is being treated? Like the more ethical questions around data extraction, and what that perhaps also what that wording triggers in you. And here you can obviously speak for a little bit on behalf of your organization, but we can also broaden it up to trends in the humanitarian context more broadly.
No, I think it's of course a very important topic, and we are like the Danish Red Cross are collecting a lot of data all the time. So we are really extracting a lot of data from the people that we work with and the communities, and that was actually, so I mentioned some main reasons for why we started looking at this, but another reason was actually also to say we collect all this data, we extract all this data from people, and are we really, giving back the value of this data that they are providing to us? Are we really giving it back to them? Are we using this data to the full extent possible to inform our responses and to support these people? So the initial idea was to see, can we actually then take this data that we're collecting and use in these models to make our response smarter? And that then turned out to be impossible. But I think that is really sort of, I think our thinking around this is how do we maximize the value that we of the data that we extract to essentially provide better services and support for vulnerable groups. I think, of course, when you talk around data consent and these type of things, we would never, of course, use this data in for example these models without making sure that we had proper consent. But I think, of course, it's a very fair criticism to say to what extent can you actually have meaningful consent in these situations where people are reliant on you to provide them with support, and are they really in a position to say no when you come with your 100 questionnaire to them and ask them to provide all this information. So it is sort of that I would say a little bit a constant struggle between and trying to find that balance. I think, as you also highlighted, like how do we harmonize it, how do we minimize that pressure, and how do we become better at collective data sharing in our sector, so we can essentially minimize the type of data that we need to extract from the people of concern.
Yeah, agree. And I think some of the themes that we are trying to work with is, for instance, how can we make, when we do need to collect data or want to inform our programming, how can we make that more interactional, so that in that process of collecting data from someone, we are actually trying also to provide them with some information that they would want. That could be, for instance, what kind of service points are available for what types of services in the area where they are living, or these types of things, so that it becomes less sort of just an extraction in the sense of the word, and also more an interaction in terms of that we can actually also, they can ask questions to us and to our volunteers and get some information that they want. So that's one thing, and I think the other one is also, at least in the Red Cross, we're trying to emphasize a lot this long-term local engagement with communities. So again, it's not necessarily coming into an area with wearing our vest, having our tablet, doing a data collection, and then going again. But there's a long process of engaging with the local community leaders and with everyone who is actually supposed to design the project and the intervention and the services that we are committed to try and provide them. So that has to be the key. And the final thing I will say that we're trying to work with, that I'm trying to push as well, is again, do we really need to do a household level survey? Oftentimes we don't. You can do needs assessments from other available sources. You can have other types of data collection exercises where you don't have to have 300 or 400 people spend 2 hours or 3 hours of their day to give them all your information. It's definitely a challenge, but something we're trying to work with.
Thank you. I think we have one more question here.
Thank you. Just a short one. I mean, both of your organizations are also involved in more local activities like the Danish asylum system. For example, to your knowledge, do you work with predictive modeling in this area as well, or any other area that your organizations are active? I'm just curious whether that's mainly in humanitarian response or also in other areas.
So far we've only looked at, we initially our initial work with IBM was actually looking at could we predict how many mixed migrants that would come from Ethiopia to 6 destination countries, including Europe. So that was also essentially could inform sort of our work here in Denmark on asylum. But we actually ended up changing the focus of the model away from that, both because the data on mixed migration is very difficult for obvious reasons, but also because of the sensitivities around predicting this and how that could be politicized and used for other purposes. So far we haven't looked at trying to predict numbers to Denmark to inform, for example, asylum caseloads and these type of things. So far we sort of tried to focus it in the international work we do.
Yeah, like my response is definitely not enough. But I think it's also a process, and I know, for instance, the British Red Cross have invested quite heavily in having also a team of data scientists looking at different elements also within the national health system. So we definitely have things where we can learn and we see where we want to learn, but it's also about having the resources to actually pursue these things in-house, which is always a tough choice on how to allocate.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jakob. I have in my network come to experience this phenomenon, lean interventions. This would be no warm hands. It would be data models and how they seem to be applied in cooperative open networks globally on a global platform. So we're talking about the local intervention, and the issue I'm being pushed is that they have this issue because, and also the sociologists, they're interesting question. Okay, yeah, left the building, but we're still in it, right? So what is the take on, because they talk about doing these sub-lean interventions, lean interventions. They supposed to function to into different matrices. Basically, one deployed system working to apply on the area, but the thing is, it doesn't seem to correspond in coding. So the thing that the larger system, the above, the connect with society and network development is more like a process which is characterized by processes conclusive in lean. But see, because this is interesting in individual context, because coding in this context is said to be very little developing, very little dynamic. So we do not go this close in data, but then again we have no very little correspondence in the system. So, and it opens up a lot of questions I mean, right now. Yeah, it's a little difficult. I know it's just okay. Yeah, listen to the voice of your own in this magic. Okay. So I've been an explainer of these system until AIs which work as leans to facilitate individuals into network development, for instance, to facilitate development for individuals in need for lean or need for advice or feed on teams in different phases. So the thing is, but the thing is, in these systems, they have these cooperative Microsoft, for instance, they have very little data flex in between the larger system, which is more or less to a lean subsystem. It's the larger system is doing conclusive on the ground of the process. However, and this is a catch because we don't want to be all dataed, right? But the coding, doing coding. No, I'm not. No, I'm trying to, because this is a different approach, and this doesn't. This is a humanitarian response category. But how would this scenario, would this have any answer?
I have to say I didn't understand exactly the question either. Did you?
Okay.
Because otherwise I would suggest we will move on to the next question.
I think that's better. That's much better.
I could give you a sheet of paper, or you can come up maybe in 5 more minutes, and then we can take it up again.
So it's quite clear, but maybe not that nice, not that good explained. It isn't such a difficult question.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get it.
It's possible to write.
There was another question over here, right? Thank you.
How interoperable would you say are your systems with the systems that other organizations might have? And I know, Emil, you mentioned moving into disease surveillance. Do you know if your system would be interoperable with systems that already exist on the ground, just like SORMAS, for example?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. I think for the specific platform developed in Malawi, there was nothing before, so that's sort of through the project we've developed that platform so they can use that in the specific programming. But when you see, for instance, the case I also mentioned from Nepal, you actually have a very strong government agency who have also sort of contracted developers to develop their own sort of portal that includes all of this. So then it's our approach to work through that portal and not create our own. That doesn't work in that sense. So, but I think it's the challenge, I think, is when you want to do something in a context and then finding out whether other solutions are there and how compatible they are and how sort of relevant they are to the specific challenge that you want to raise, because it can also be a very large project to just engage with existing platforms. That requires a lot of sort of engaging with those partners and those stakeholders who are interested in it. I think that should definitely be the default approach, that you utilize things that are already there, and also talking about the open source agenda. Because the more we build, that's also something we've learned, I think, definitely. The more we build specific solutions also based on project funding, then when that project ends, if there isn't a structure there to actually keep it running and make use of it, then I mean, what kind of impact, what kind of value did you actually create? So no, for sure, it's something that we're still learning how to do better, but a very good question and a good sort of challenge.
Yeah, no, if I can also just add, I think it's really a key issue, but a bit also a challenge that you have a lot of exploration in this field. A lot of different actors are making different types of model, and there can be overlap and synergies between these, and there is often a tendency, which we've seen also from a lot of the data collection processes out there, where we've sort of been, wanting to have our own little surveys because we have our own little focus, and we want to have our specific background variables we can check against, and all these type of things. You have the same issue again a bit with these models, that someone else also has a displacement model, for example, but it's just slightly different, or the time horizon or the geographical area is different. So we're trying and seeing how can we come together and make sort of joint systems, because it becomes a huge issue if we start working in countries and there are similar models, but for example, what if they're predicting different things and we're not speaking to each other? So what we want to try to work with, and we will hopefully do some work on this in Somalia, is to essentially have all these different models come together and not sort of not be joined, but essentially so you can see that, okay, these models are predicting X, Y, Z, and these other models are predicting the same, and you have the conflict models that are predicting and when you can then see that the models are essentially also starting to predict the same things, then you can also be more certain that these things are happening. But it is a big issue of making models that can speak to each other and or not speak to each other, but that can be compatible and can be integrated into the similar system.
In case that there is no other question left, then I would perhaps give you one last exercise. I would like to know if you had to predict how the work with data, with algorithms and predictive modeling will look like in, like, let's say 10 to 20 years in the work that you're doing. And perhaps you can even say 10 to 20, but also in 50 years. What would you say? What would you predict? After that, we can come to an end. So one last.
Oh, I get to start that one. Okay, thank you. Many different ways that things can go. I think for sure this will play a bigger role, because, like you mentioned, also working with historical data, we see many areas and many thematic areas where that work basically begun sometime, if you're lucky, in the 80s, sometimes in the 90s, and sometimes just in this decade. But working with these models really requires a lot of historical data to make them accurate. And I think, again, if we're looking 50 years ahead, I imagine we will have a lot more historical data to actually train these models on. But I think something that I know will definitely be advocating is, again, really working ethically and sort of principle-based with exactly these models. And when we talk about AI and how much you actually hand over the decision-making process to an algorithm, and how much you actually want to have a human in there to make a context analysis of the outputs and the insights that the model is predicting. Yeah, sure. Maybe that was your question. Yeah, so I think that's definitely one, and I think the other one that we are definitely wanting to engage with now is not necessarily the generative AI, but more the natural language processing that's sort of underlining a lot of the AI models we're seeing now. Because, again, as an anthropology background, there's a lot of narrative data that we've been working with, especially in the humanitarian sector for the past decades as well. We have a lot of huge records of evaluations and reports and these type of things. So if we can actually start tapping into that sort of knowledge bank and those types of data sources, I think that's going to be very valuable for us, at least, I think.
Yeah, no, a few follow-up predictions. I think, just picking up on the natural language processing, I think something we are quite keen on sort of exploring is especially of now we have these models, and if we can then, as you say, start actually looking at all the project documents we've had, all the evaluations that can tell us what worked, what doesn't work, that we can actually start having these, for example, like a chatbot or something that can help us say, well, now it's predicting that this is going to happen in Burkina Faso. So what then? What's next? What are we going to do about this? And then it can actually also tell, well, based on what you've done so far and what usually works, based on all these evaluations from your own work and other organizations, this would make sense to do in that type of context, for example. I think another thing I would like to potentially see or would be interested in is I think the way that at least our work and a lot of other in this space has worked has really been focused around building models that you could say, can they replace humans in some sense? Like, can we predict, like I showed, like, are we better at predicting the future displacement than the humanitarian response plans? And I think we're reaching a conclusion that, yeah, it can, and in some instances it's more accurate, and then tend to be more accurate. But maybe where we should focus our efforts is not so much on just generally replacing humans and being 10% better at predicting displacement. Maybe where we should focus our efforts is to say, well, humans are good at predicting these 80%. So we develop the models that predict the last 20%, the unprecedented events or the others that are difficult. Because why? I mean, it's just in some sense a waste of resources trying to predict what we can already predict and then some, instead of just focusing on the last mile. And then 50 years from now, I think what we of course should see then is that all our impact-based models and all our forecasts of displacements are continuously wrong, because we have the predictions and then we act and prevent and mitigate these shocks from actually happening. So that's where we end up in 50 years' time.
And I think that's a beautiful way to to close the seminar today. I'd like to thank both of you very much for coming here. It was a pleasure to hear what you're working with, what your organization does, and thank you so much for answering all of these questions. I know that were a lot. And also thank you for coming here in person as well as the online participants. It was a real pleasure to have this discussion today. We will, however, because it's a seminar series, have 2 more seminars coming up on the 22nd of November, which will be on data extractivism in tech for good, the need for black box ethnography, and on December 5th, the data extractivism and the colonization of human life. So thank you very much.
Thank you.